reading Fred Sanders' article or chapter in Advancing Trinitarian Theology, Explorations in Constructive Dogmatics. His chapter was on what the Trinity is for. I spoke previously about that kind of spectrum that he created. He also has created this quite helpful set of axes, which basically delineates the parameters of Trinitarian theology. How does one construe this relationship between the immanent and the economic, between the Son and the Spirit and the Father, and how all of our theology has to be done within those parameters if it's Trinitarian. I was also interested to see that he pointed out that in cultures that find themselves faced with multi-religious, multi-ethnic kind of contexts, the Trinity sees a resurgence. There's kind of a resurgence in the doctrine of the Trinity to indicate how unique Christianity is. And it's interesting to see how in our culture that has become quite multicultural, we've seen this renaissance of Trinitarian theology almost as a response to those people who kind of want to compare our doctrine of God to others, but this kind of doctrine that God is triune is unique and individual. So some interesting thoughts there that he put forward, and this kind of chart means that we can talk about the Son in and who he is as a result of what he's revealed himself to be. Like, he basically says there's an immanent Son and an economic Son, and an immanent Spirit and an economic Spirit, in the sense that what we know about the Son might not exhaust all our knowledge of the Son. What was he saying? In terms of how I make sense of that, relationship between the immanent Trinity and the economic Trinity, it seems clear to me from Scripture, which should, I think, norm one's approach to how God has revealed himself. It seems to me that Scripture reveals a God who wants to reveal himself. That we can actually know things about who God is in himself as a result of what he's done. And I'm also slightly suspicious of apophatic theology. Not that apophatic theology is a bad thing in and of itself, but I think it's worth approaching apophaticism with some caution, as well as cataphatism. Anyway, it's worth approaching both of those points of view of theological discourse with some caution, but I think it's clear that common sense would say that we can say things of God and refer to who he actually is. Like, the regular person in the pew won't generally take an apophatic approach to talking about God. And I guess my worry is that a pure apophatism almost makes theological discourse the prerogative of the elite, and regular Christians almost like quite a primitive bunch. But I think G.K. Chesterton, when I was reading what he was saying, he generally seemed to say that what most of the normal people believe is usually what will be true. And I think that's worth taking into account when talking about God as who he is and how he's revealed himself. So there are my thoughts at the moment. So this kind of immanent economic distinction, what Trinitarian theology is for, the spectrum of views as to what we can deduce about God in and of himself from the economy of salvation, and how that's related to theological discourse. I think the next place to go would be Lewis Ayres' book. I'm going to have a look at Nicaea and its legacy, because in Advancing Trinitarian Theology, they pointed out that Ayres had challenged that kind of distinction that fueled a lot of the Renaissance in Trinitarian theology, and and social doctrines of the Trinity, he's challenged that distinction between East and West that often comes up in those earlier books. And so it'd be interesting to see how that kind of fault line of Trinitarian theology changes and develops up until the present day, because clearly at the start of the period I'm looking at, Moltmann believes that it's quite an obvious distinction, and throughout a decade or 2 decades after he was writing, this East-West split is kind of taken for granted. But I think, as far as I'm aware, Ayres challenges that distinction, and I think that's definitely worth looking at, because that could mean a total reversal, or at least a good deal more caution when addressing these kind of Eastern Western distinctives. I was reading an article by Sarah Coakley, and she noted how we can't misconstrue Gregory. I can't remember which Gregory it was, but we can't misconstrue the Gregories as offering a purely social doctrine of the Trinity, primarily because they were committed to doctrines of divine simplicity. So there's plenty to take into account there, and I'll move on to how interpretation of the Fathers has changed as a result of Ayres and some of the other work that's been done in patristics, and how that affects what we might deduce about a theology of the Trinity. So there we go.